Craziest ways humans tried to cheat death. The oldest fear ever written down. The oldest story ever found that was written by human hands is not a story of war. It is not a myth of creation. This is not a record of kings, or of harvests, or of floods, but all these are there. Fundamentally, underneath everything, it is a story about a man who watched his best friend die, and who was so afraid of his own death, he walked to the edge of the known world to find a way out of it. The Epic of Gilgamesh was composed in ancient Mesopotamia some 4,000 years ago. Gilgamesh was a king, 2 parts god, 1 part man, and in his world's logic that made him more powerful than almost anyone alive, but not powerful enough to escape death. When his best friend Enkidu died, Gilgamesh did not mourn in silence. He left his kingdom and went alone over deserts and mountains and the waters of death itself to find Utnapishtim, the only human being whom the gods had made immortal. He wanted the secret. He believed it was there. He was going to find. The secret, Utnapishtim told him, is a plant that grows on the floor of the sea. Gilgamesh went down, found it, and pulled it up. In his hand he held true immortality. Then he lay down to rest beside a pool of water. A snake smelling the plant ate it while he slept. Gilgamesh sat by the water and cried. He went home. He is dead. It's not the age of this story that makes it significant. It is that someone thought was so important it was worth carving into clay tablets and saving. Death was so central to human experience that the first storytellers made it the engine of the first epic. 4,000 years ago, the most powerful man in the world was not afraid of enemies or sickness. He was afraid of the same thing that everybody after him was afraid of, and he was prepared to go to the end of the earth to get it fixed. He was not the last one. The pharaohs who engineered eternity. For about 3,000 years, the most powerful civilization on earth was structured around a single obsession. Not conquest, not trade, not science. The main project of ancient Egypt, the thing that used more resources and human labor than anything else the civilization produced, was to make sure that the people at the top of it never died permanently. The belief system was elaborate and precise. Death was not the end. It was a transition to a parallel existence which needed the physical body to be intact. If the body rotted, the soul had nowhere to go. Without a place for the soul to go back to, the afterlife was over. So, the body had to be preserved, forever, indefinitely, against all that nature does to organic matter the moment life leaves it. To facilitate this, the Egyptians developed a 7-day procedure involving the removal of all internal organs except the heart, dissolving the brain and extracting it via the nose, filling the body cavity with natron salt to extract all remaining moisture, wrapping the preserved remains in hundreds of meters of linen, and encasing everything in a series of nested containers designed to preserve the contents for eternity. That was only the body. The tomb itself was an engineering project all by itself. It took an estimated 20,000 workers working for about 20 years to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. It consists of more than 2 million stone blocks, some weighing up to 80 tons, positioned with a precision that has confounded modern engineers for decades. Inside, the chambers were stuffed with food, furniture, servants, boats, and everything a pharaoh might need to continue living in comfort in whatever lay ahead. It all boils down to one idea: that death could be avoided if the preparation was thorough enough. That if you could control enough variables, save enough details, close enough chambers, then that thing we were all afraid of losing could somehow be kept. The pharaohs had been wrong about the mechanism, but the size of what they built trying speaks to something important about how seriously the most powerful people on earth took the problem. They did not accept dying. They answered it with architecture, and they weren't the only empire that decided the solution to dying was something you could manufacture. The emperors who drank poison every morning. In 221 BCE, a man named Yingzheng became the first emperor to unify China under one rule. He named himself Qin Shi Huang, which means roughly first emperor. He built the first beginnings of the Great Wall. He standardized the writing system and the currency throughout an empire of millions. By just about every measure of power known to the ancient world, he had more power than just about any human being who ever lived. And he was frightened to death. Qin Shi Huang forbade the word death to be spoken in his presence. Anyone who uttered it in his presence was in danger of death. At the same time, he built a tomb that took 39 years and 700,000 workers to complete, with rivers of liquid mercury and guarded by 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers. He sent an expedition of 3,000 people across the sea looking for a mythical island where a tree of immortality supposedly grew. None of them returned. Then he asked his court alchemists and they gave him a thing they called the Pill of Immortality. It was mostly made of cinnabar, a bright red mineral that alchemists thought had special powers because it could turn from a solid to a liquid state. Cinnabar is essentially a mercury sulfide. He took it down every day for years. He grew paranoid and erratic and, with time, increasingly violent. He ceased to appear in public. He died in 210 BC at the age of 49. The mercury he had taken daily to keep himself alive had been poisoning him systematically from within. Modern soil tests around his sealed tomb still reveal mercury levels so high, the site remains too dangerous to excavate fully 2,200 years later. What happened next is the part that is really hard to process. 1,000 years later, the same story was repeated in the same civilization. The Ming Dynasty Jiajing Emperor in the 1500s was also obsessed with immortality. His Taoist priests dosed him daily with an elixir of mercury, arsenic, and lead. He took it for 20 years. He grew paranoid and violent. He gave up the official business of running an empire. His borders were weakened. He was 59 when he died. The heavy metals that had been accumulating in his tissues over years, almost certainly hastening the end he was desperately trying to hold off. 2 emperors. More than 1,000 years separate them. The same civilization, same solution, the same result. Not because they were stupid men, but because the fear that motivated them was stronger than any evidence that they could find to contradict it. The alchemists who accidentally invented science. For about 1,000 years, in medieval Europe, a dedicated group of researchers devoted their lives to the production of a single substance which they named the Philosopher's Stone. The name sounds mythological. The project itself was rather serious. The belief was a specific one. There was a substance somewhere in the natural world, either waiting to be discovered or waiting to be synthesized from the right combination of materials, that had 2 properties. It could turn base metals into gold, and it can, if properly prepared and taken in the right form, prevent the aging of the human body. The second property was known as the elixir of life, and to those who sought it was no fantasy. It was an unsolved problem in the chemistries. They were not superstitious people acting on no knowledge. The medieval alchemists were among the most intellectually rigorous thinkers of their age. They systematically developed experimental procedures. They recorded their methods in great detail so that results could be replicated. They built laboratories, designed special equipment, and spent years running controlled trials on materials. They were doing something that looked a lot like science, searching for something that science would one day show was impossible. And on the way, they found accidental things that were not impossible at all. Early alchemists discovered and isolated several chemical elements. Their methods of distillation are still used in modern chemistry and medicine. They discovered acids. They produced alloys, pharmaceutical compounds that actually worked. The laboratory techniques that would eventually become modern chemistry were a direct extension of the tools and practices developed by people who were really just trying to find a way to live forever. The Philosopher's Stone was never discovered. They never manufactured the elixir of life. But the centuries of hard-nosed experimentation they did in search of it laid the foundations of a whole different kind of knowledge, one that would someday produce medicines capable of extending human life by decades. They were looking for immortality. Instead, they found something more useful. The tragedy, or perhaps the irony, is that the people who did this work never personally profited from what they built. They lived and died as men live, and in the same lifespans as all others. They left behind them laboratories and notebooks of observations that later generations would turn into real science. They weren't the last to pursue immortality at serious personal cost, and to leave behind something unexpected. The woman who turned gold into poison. There was a woman in 16th century France who did something almost no one in the history of European courts had ever successfully done. In a place built to replace people the moment they showed any sign of aging, she had held the romantic interest of a king for decades and was almost 20 years older than him. Her name was Diane de Poitiers, and she was the mistress of Henry II of France, in a court in which everyone's political survival depended on remaining useful and attractive. Diane remained the king's principal companion for more than 20 years as younger women vied for his attention. A historian who visited her 6 months before her death said her skin was unusually white and smooth. She held herself erect, and she looked decades younger than her actual age. Her reasons for this were not purely genetic. Diane drank a liquid preparation made with gold every morning. Her doctors had explained the rationale in terms that made perfect sense with the medical knowledge of the day. Gold never rusts. Gold never will rust. None of the natural processes that affect other materials cause gold to decay. If those properties could be imparted to the human body by ingestion, the body might acquire some of the same resistance to decay. There was nothing unusual about the logic. This was the accepted medical theory. She kept up this practice for years, perhaps decades. She also swam in cold water every morning and rode horses every day, habits that historians have noted would have contributed authentically to her physical condition regardless of whatever else she was doing. Henry died in 1559 in a jousting accident. His wife, Catherine de' Medici, who had watched Diane hold a position that should have been hers for 20 years, quickly forced her out of court. Diane continued to drink the gold preparation and spent the rest of her life in a castle that Henry had given her. She died in 1566 at the age of 66. In 2009, French scientists studied her remains. They found that the amount of gold in her hair was 500 times what is considered normal. She had a great deal of internal deterioration in her bones. The analysis concluded that the most probable cause of the physical decline that preceded her death was chronic poisoning by gold. The scientists noted that the pale, luminous skin that had made her a star at court, and that she maintained with extraordinary consistency over decades, was a known symptom of gold toxicity. The preparation she thought saved her look ruined the look and the body under it. She was drinking what was killing her because it made her look like she wasn't. The man who swapped blood with a dying student. Alexander Bogdanov was not some fringe strange thinker. He was one of the original Bolsheviks who helped Lenin construct the Soviet Union, a trained doctor, a published philosopher, a science fiction writer who wrote novels about technologies that did not yet exist. He was one of the most intellectually earnest men in Russia of the early 20th century by any reasonable standard. He became convinced that the blood exchanged between the young and the old could turn back the aging clock altogether. His theory was based on ideology, and it fit perfectly within the political framework he had helped to establish. If Soviet citizens are to share labor equally, why not share biological youth equally? He termed it physiological collectivism. The idea was that regular exchange of blood between generations would spread vitality throughout the population, just as communism was supposed to spread resources. Nobody would ever grow old. All would be well for everyone. He tried it on himself first. In the course of years, he gave 11 transfusions from younger donors. After each, he carefully documented his results. He could see better now. His hair stopped falling. People who knew him said he looked 10 years younger than his age. He thought he was onto something real, and in 1926, he opened the world's first dedicated blood transfusion institute in Moscow. Even Lenin's own sister signed up for his program. A waiting list developed. In April 1928, Bogdanov performed his 12th transfusion. The donor was a 21-year-old student. No one knew the student had active tuberculosis and malaria. The student was transfused with Bogdanov's healthy blood and recovered completely. He lived to be in his 80s. Bogdanov fell ill days after receiving a student's infected blood. He refused outside medical intervention and instead spent his final hours clinically recording his own symptoms, noting his pulse, his temperature, the changing color of his skin, until he could no longer write. The same experiment he believed kept him alive killed him at the age of 54. The man whose jaw fell off. Eben Byers was the sort of person the early 20th century liked to celebrate. A Yale graduate, a wealthy socialite, and an amateur golf champion who had won the United States Amateur Championship in 1906. He was a healthy man, a man respected by the public, the kind of man whose picture appeared in the papers for reasons other than scandal. By all measures, during the first 4 decades of his life, Eben Byers was a success story. Then, in 1927, he fell out of a train bunk and hurt his arm. The injury itself was not severe. What followed it was, a doctor had recommended a product named Radithor, marketed at the time as a scientifically advanced health tonic. The active ingredients were distilled water and radium, a newly discovered radioactive element that was being enthusiastically added to consumer products before anyone quite knew what it did to the human body. Radithor wasn't fringe medicine. It was sold openly, endorsed publicly, and consumed by thousands of people across the United States who believed that radioactivity was a form of concentrated natural energy that could be absorbed beneficially by the body. Byers tried it and, almost immediately, felt remarkable. Not his arm only. His energy levels went up. His spirits lifted. He felt, by his own telling, younger, more vital than he had in years. He started drinking 3 bottles a day. He sent cases to his girlfriends. He sent bottles to his racehorses. For almost 3 years, he drank an estimated 1,400 bottles of radioactive water, quite sure that it was making him healthier. By 1931, his jaw was beginning to fall apart. His head was full of holes. His teeth had fallen out except 5. For years, the radium had been gathering in his bones, slowly destroying them from inside, while he continued to drink. He died in 1932 at 51 years. His body was so full of radioactive material that it had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. When scientists examined his remains 33 years later, his bones still gave off measurable radiation. The Wall Street Journal's headline announcing his death is one of the more accurate single sentences in the annals of American journalism. It said, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off." Here's the only thing that every person in the video have in common. They did not want to die. And that one fear, The most human fear ever was enough to make brilliant, powerful, otherwise rational people swallow mercury, drink radioactive water, inject themselves with animal tissue, transfuse infected blood into their own veins. The techniques changed from century to century and from one civilization to another, but the fear that drove them never did. And that fear is still present. It's in every anti-aging product ever sold, every supplement ever marketed, every promise ever made that science is close to cracking the aging problem permanently. We are still Gilgamesh. Our packaging is simply better. If this video made you think, comment below. And if you want to see more stories like these, subscribe, because there are a lot more where this came from.